Good morning to you all. Good morning. I'd like to welcome all of you to Birkbeck today. My name is David Feldman. I'm the director of the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism. It's a cliche, but it's a cliche which is true in this case, that it's absolutely wonderful to see so many of you here today. The response to this event is an illustration, a demonstration, I think, of the urgency and the significance of the themes that we will be discussing today. Relations between the mainstream Jewish population and its concerns about anti-Semitism, alongside its identification with Israel, relations between that population and the anti-racist movement, which identifies Israel as an apartheid state, I think it's fair to say have reached a nadir in the context of the current catastrophic war on Gaza. But the problem that we face is not just a problem of the current moment. I wonder if you could put that on silent, please. It's not just a problem of the current moment. The problems we face are larger and deeper than the present war on Gaza. A part of this lies with the question of how anti-Semitism can be integrated into the concerns, into the agenda of an anti-racist movement for which the legacies of colonialism and enslavement are, for good reasons, central, and which often conceives of racism in terms of a black-white binary. Arguably, Jews are not the only group that fits uneasily within this nexus. There is the specificity of Islamophobia, for example, which we have to reckon with, and which we will reckon with in the course of today, and the stigmatization of gypsies, Roma, and travellers is another casualty of the conventional conceptualization of racism as a legacy, or as only a legacy, of colonialism and enslavement. We have, I hope, an exciting programme today. I'm excited by it, at any rate, in which we will address these questions. And if you're not excited, I'm sorry for you. You're here all day. We will address these questions from a plurality of standpoints, from the social sciences, from history, and from advocacy. Speakers have been asked to keep to time. And, well, you laugh, but there's a quid pro quo here, which is that that's to enable space for questions and discussions, But the quid pro quo is that I ask you not to use that as an opportunity to deliver another paper. That will drive a coach and horses through the day, and, as they used to say in school, spoil it for everyone else. Well, without further delay, I will introduce our first speaker, who is Gary Younge from the University of Manchester. Gary's many, many accomplishments and awards are all listed on a piece of paper that you all should have, and I will not take up time by rehearsing them now, much as I would like to. Instead, I will simply give you the title of his paper and say how thrilled and delighted I am that he has agreed to kick off our conference today. So, without further ado, I introduce Gary Younge, who will speak on colouring between the lines, what the experiences of black Germans in Nazi Germany tells us about systems of racial oppression in general and anti-Semitism in particular. Gary.
Thank you, David. I'll start with a story from my childhood. As a 10-year-old, my mum made me, literally made me, she woke me up. I was asleep because it was on late. She made me watch the Holocaust miniseries. It seemed like an odd thing for a mother to do, but her thing was, this is your story too, she told me. And at 10, it didn't take me very long to figure out kind of what she meant by that. And obviously she didn't mean that literally. And I would say, I was shocked in the solipsistic way that a 10-year-old might be. I was also very scared by it because I could see the personal relevance. But I was also baffled by it because at that age, the only discrimination that I had experienced involved me being visibly different, and that visibility I carried with me everywhere. So when I thought more deeply about the things that I had seen in that show, I just couldn't help wondering why the Jews hadn't just said that they weren't Jewish. I was 10. Why, if my experience was one and my understanding of discrimination was one of visibility, then I looked at it and thought, but they're all white people. And so how would they know? How would they know? And why didn't they just say, well, no, you've got the wrong person? And that confusion didn't haunt me like the images of the camps haunted me, but it took me about another 10 years when my brother was living in the north of Ireland to reach a kind of understanding that, once again, these were all white people. And yet, within 3 questions, I could find out, what's your name? If that didn't work, where do you live? If that didn't work, where did you go to school? I could find out what religion someone was, and more to the point, I guess, I wanted to know. And so I kind of made it my business to try and find out, and we can interrogate that later if you want to. But that, and that my brother being there was partly understood to be separate from the whole thing, unless people thought that he might be in the military. Very few black people in Northern Ireland, or even fewer then. And so he grew a beard, because you couldn't have a beard and be in the army. And so, it's just a small kind of reflection on the various ways. And this was when I then looked back to the miniseries I'd seen and thought, okay, so you make it your business to know, then you can know. If a society is constructed in this way, then that's kind of what it will be. But also that there are these subtle markers, and if you're looking for them, you will find them. That was the thing that he did to make himself safe, and it worked. And when I spoke to non-Irish people, they would say, and this was not true either, as recent events have shown, yeah, your colour here is not such a big problem. And then there was an apocryphal story of a Sikh who comes to Northern Ireland, and somebody says, well, that's very interesting, you're a Sikh, but are you a Catholic Sikh or a Protestant Sikh? Because those are the markers that we care about. And that brings me to the subject of this talk, colouring between the lines. Because in my research on post-war Black Europe, I've become familiar with a range of work around the experiences of Black Germans under the Nazis that offer some insight, I think, into the ambivalent role that visible difference can play in a system of racial oppression, and in some sense show how that works out as a lived experience. Throughout this talk, I would argue that it would be helpful to think of racism as a language with many dialects that are recognisable to all, but also recognisably different in their articulation, history, cultural influence and context. Rare is the country or culture that does not speak the language of racism, but in no two places is it spoken the same. I want to say also at the outset that those looking for a thumbs up or thumbs down, it was worse for one group than it was for another, are in the wrong place. There is enough misery to go around. This is really a talk for people who would rather understand how the misery is made so they can eradicate it than those who want to measure it so that they can rank it. There will be comparisons and parallels. There will be no equivalencies or competition. Now, this particular story starts in 1884 with the Berlin Conference called by Otto von Bismarck to carve up what remained of Africa among the European powers. Most of the good stuff had gone by then, but the Germans got their hands on Namibia, Togo, Cameroon, and what they called German East Africa, which includes Tanzania's mainland as well as some of Burundi, Rwanda, and a small piece of Mozambique. For the most part, the Germans organised their colonies according to the same rules of brutality and bigotry as other European powers, with one exception. Between 1904 and 1908, they committed the century's first genocide against the Herero and Nama people in Namibia. During the first phase, they trapped the people in the desert, where they died of dehydration and starvation. Those who were left taken to concentration camps, where they died of disease and exhaustion. Now, I mention all this to establish that when it came to black people, Germany had a track record. When it came to anti-black racism, that was in many ways indistinguishable from other powers in Europe, although this was more extreme than others had done. And it also locates what will come next as part of a continuum. In the words of the late Tony Judt in post-war, overseas, in their colonies, European states had habitually indentured or enslaved indigenous populations for their own benefit. They had not been above the use of torture, mutilation, or mass murder to coerce their victims into obedience. But since the 18th century, these practices were largely unknown among Europeans themselves, at least west of the Bug and Prut rivers. Put bluntly, to a significant extent, the shock following the Holocaust resided not so much in the fact that a European state had committed these atrocities, but that they had committed them in Europe and against other Europeans. Following their defeat in the First World War, the Germans had their colonies taken away from them and redistributed among more responsible colonial powers. As part of the wartime reparations, the Versailles Treaty also ordered the Germans to relinquish the Rhineland to victorious powers. The French took the lion's share and sent black colonial troops from North and West Africa to Germany as an occupying force. To be occupied by foreign troops was bad enough. To be occupied by black people was more than the Germans could bear. There you have brutality, bestiality, egality. One of the German posters depicting what would be called the horror on the Rhine. There was a moral panic was confected from misinformation that bestial black men with uncontrollable sexual urges were ravaging and raping German women. They called it the Schwarze or black horror. There's never any evidence, there's never been any evidence that women under occupation in those areas were any more vulnerable to rape than by occupying soldiers anywhere else. But just as was the case in Southport last month, there was a market for this kind of racially loaded misinformation with willing buyers and willing sellers. 400 to 500 children who emerged from relationships with colonial troops were branded the Rhineland bastards. And this was the basis for a Netflix original about a young black girl and her mother during Nazi Germany called Where Hands Touch, which I recommend. It's not brilliant, but it's not bad. That's pretty high praise, I think, for stuff that just comes straight out of Netflix. 400 to 500 children who emerged from relationships with colonial troops were branded the Rhineland bastards. In Mein Kampf, Adolf Hitler described them as a contamination of the white race by Negro blood on the Rhine in the heart of Europe. This was not a particularly remarkable view for a white European to hold at the time, but of course he didn't stop there. Hitler argued that Jews were responsible for bringing Negroes into the Rhineland with the ultimate idea of bastardizing the white race, which they hate, and thus lowering its cultural and political level so that the Jew might dominate. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, they passed a law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring. And in 1937, 2 years after Nuremberg, local officials were asked to identify all of the mixed-race children born in the Rhineland and subject them to forcible sterilisation. So, by the time it came to the Second World War, black Germans as a whole numbered in the thousands. Some were born to local women and French colonial troops in the Rhineland. Some were offspring of white Germans and local people who had met in the colonies. Many were students or workers who'd come from the former colonies and stayed. Few Germans would have met a black person, but most would know of their presence, thanks in no small part to the Rhineland Horror campaign. Now, there have been a range of autobiographies by and interviews with black Germans at the time suggest a variety of experiences, but with two commonalities. The one that I'm not using here because it's the one that's probably the best known is Destined to Witness by Hans Massaquoi, who went on to become the editor of Ebony. And in German it's called Neger, Neger, Stormsteinpfleger, which is a set of insults that compare him to a chimney sweep for reasons that aren't that difficult to imagine. And a feature worth noting in passing, and I just want to notice in passing here, is the degree to which Nazi Germany borrowed from the United States the racial architecture when it came to constructing a system of racial control. And that's painfully set out in James Q. Whitman's Hitler's American Model. So one of the most compelling accounts of the time is a book called Black German by Theodore Michael. Michael was born in Berlin in 1925, the youngest son of a Cameroonian immigrant and his white German wife. He was 8 when the Nazis came to power, not much younger than I was when I watched the Holocaust. I'm not sure if I said this, but these two commonalities. The first is that all of the black Germans were subject to a system of racial control and oppression which excluded them from full citizenship and equal rights that carried with it the threat of extermination. So that's the first thing I want to talk about. As a child, Theodore Michael could see the system was discriminating between people but didn't understand that it was discriminating against him. He writes in his book, "When the Jews were insulted, especially in Der Stürmer, I didn't think much of it. I had Jewish schoolmates and they acted just like everyone else. You only noticed that they were Jews when there was a head count or survey of the students and they were counted separately," which happened to me too. But that didn't mean anything at that point, and it made no difference to the atmosphere in the classroom. There was a lot in those papers about racial aliens, but it didn't occur to me at that time that I was what was meant by that phrase. He wanted to join the Jugendvolk, which was like, if you imagine Hitler Youth as the Scouts, then Jugendvolk is the Cubs. And he says, almost all of my school, well, that is the way that they understood it. Nearly every single male autobiography talks about, well, my mates were joining the Hitler Youth and it seemed like a lot of fun. And some of them were allowed in, and this is one of the things that we learn here, because whoever's running it is the father of a friend, and they say, oh, well, you know, Hans, you're just like us, really, come on, you know. And then others would be denied. And Theodore Michael was denied. He says, naturally my friends urged me to come along, so they thought he'd be fine. And we went to the next meeting, and just as naturally I was sent away again. And before I went, though, it was made clear to me that I was not one of the Volk, and accordingly couldn't be a member of the Jugendvolk. And this was him learning the nature of his difference. And from this point on, things changed at school. The atmosphere wasn't poisoned yet, but schoolmates, he says, looked at him differently, and I saw them with new eyes too. Throughout this time, he starts to understand that he has to avoid hospitals, however ill he gets, because even though he wasn't born in the Rhineland, if he goes to hospital, he will be sterilised. And so this is factored into his calculations. At 14, not surprisingly really, he is diagnosed by a friendly doctor with stomach ulcers. He says, I spent my adolescence ducking, hiding, and trying not to be noticed. Now you see here how we're trying not to be noticed. He's black in Nazi Germany. Of course they bloody notice. How could they not notice? And yet there is some way in which people can notice and yet not decipher. Then there was, so that's Theodore Michael. He only died a few years ago, actually. Then there was Fazia Jensen, who went on to be a singer. Born in Hamburg to the Liberian consul general and a mother who worked in the consulate. Expelled from school at 13. Theodore was also expelled from school. And there was kind of quite touching. This is his head teacher says, unfortunately, new regulations required him to dismiss me from school. That had nothing to do with my academic performance. It had to do with the new era. Fazia is she's expelled from school. She goes to a dance school. Then the director of the dance school says, well, I can't have you in the dance school because I will get in trouble with the Reich Cultural Office. You have to imagine when the curtain goes up and there's a black girl standing there, I will get in trouble. When she got her period, then she had to start worrying about sterilisation too and keeping out of people's way. There was Gert Schramm, one of the few black survivors of the camps, who was the son of an African-American engineer and a white German woman. He was born in 29 in Thuringia, which was the East German land that just voted for the AfD. His dad was caught coming back to see his mum. It was a proper and solid relationship, and was sent to Auschwitz. Schramm himself was arrested a couple of years later, and after several months in the Gestapo prison was sent to Buchenwald, where he survived until the end of the war. It's a very touching story about how he is he's put in with the political prisoners, and here again, they don't quite know where to put them, don't quite know what to do with him. And he says being with the political prisoners is what he thinks saved his life, because they made it a priority to protect him. This is his book, Wer hat Angst vor dem schwarzen Mann, Who's Afraid of the Black Man, which has not been translated. And then there was Martha Stark. This is Jean Vost, who was also in Dachau. I think the number of black people in the camps didn't top 30 or 40 in the end. Martha Stark, whose testimony came from Remapping Black Germany, which is edited by Sarah Lennox. She has one of the most vivid. She was interviewed in the Pittsburgh Courier, which is an African-American paper, and it's one of the most vivid and kind of emblematic accounts. She was born in 1914 in Nuremberg to an African-American dad and a white German mum. She was told by Jewish contemporaries, we're leaving, you should leave too. And she says, I couldn't believe that anybody would try to bother us. We harm nobody. If we leave, we will appear guilty of something. So you can see that there is and then another Jewish friend who was leaving also warns her, look, you've got to get out. But in her mind and in her reality, does not apply to her. And she married a white German and had children, but and in the end had to move from the city she lived into a quieter city. So there was a system of oppression and ideology that included black people and that black people were aware of. All of these people had to change their lives considerably. All of them, big things happened to them. And the fact that in 1942, as the final solution was really taking off, Heinrich Himmler asked for a census of black Germans, suggested the Nazis may have had plans to refine the system that they had. But all of the testimony from that era suggests that while the system was in place, when it came to black people, its implementation was inconsistent, and the ideology underpinning it less well rehearsed and formally scripted than for others. In short, while their persecution was systemic, it was not systematic. Visible difference marked them out as inferior and to be excluded. It did not, however, in and of itself, provide instructions as how to handle that inferiority. So, black Germans existed in these liminal spaces where the threat of annihilation was omnipresent, but where their ultimate fate was unpredictable. They couldn't effectively hide, and it would be a struggle to be hidden. This is the same reason why there were relatively few black resistance fighters in Europe compared to the number of black prisoners of war. Most of them certainly couldn't pass. There is a reason, go back to this picture, he doesn't have a triangle or a star because he doesn't need one. He's wearing the triangle or the star on his face. In every story that I've cited, there are these brushes with peril. But there's also space to navigate and negotiate until the next moment of peril. So of his school days, Theodore Michael writes, some of the teachers clearly belonged to the Nazi party, but our teachers were mostly sympathetic to me, especially when it came to sports. He heard two teachers say he was a fast runner. Two teachers say he's a great prospect for the 44 Olympics. Too bad. Throughout, he had to both keep himself fed and keep himself alive and avoid the worst of every situation. So if he saw that there was a colleague or a character where he was working who was insisting that he Heil Hitler them or assisting, he would just kind of find a way to circumvent that particular person and find the next person who would be kind. With Stark tells an incredible story that's in Remapping Black Germany of going to the swimming pool and meeting there her friend who was Jewish, and her friend being muscled out of the swimming pool by four Nazis who said, we don't want a dirty Jew in the water or whatever. And then a guy who she's told is a bigwig in the Nazi party then says, hey, you too, black girl, you get out. And two of the four kids who've just harassed the Jewish kid and forced him out of the pool turn on the man who is trying to kick her out and says, no, we know her. She can stay. She's okay. And a very public altercation transpires. And then, even weirder, Martha Stark writes to the local Nazi office. This is how entitled she feels to be a German, and says, she literally says, this guy makes the Nazis look bad. That's literally what she said. You are treating me terribly. He was treating me terribly. And she's invited to the local HQ. And she goes, and she writes about a certain sense of trepidation when she goes, but she goes, and after they make a few jokes about her being black, they then call in the man who abused her and force him to apologize. Doesn't kind of get me some of this stuff. But as I say, she marries, she has a child. She moves from the city that she's in because she thinks it's not safe to a smaller place. But then her friend, who's in the party, a person called Kneufer, warns her to leave. And he says to her, with pain written all over his face, I'm quoting her now, they had received an order to send me and my girls to Auschwitz. He said that my marriage had been automatically annulled because Herbert, her husband, and I had married against the law, and he would do his best to delay sending us away. She stayed put, and a few days later Kneufer comes again. He was terribly upset, she writes. He said that the Nazis were putting pressure on him, that the authorities at Auschwitz had complained because my children and I had not reached there according to orders. He wrung his hand as though in great perplexity. He said he could allow me to stay in Berlin, where she was, no more than 1 more week. He seemed to pray with me that the Americans would come, which they did, and so she didn't go to the camps. A particularly salient story, I think, is of Hans Hauck, whose story we largely know because of Tina Kamp's Other Germans, where she interviews him. He was born in 1920. He was born in the Rhineland. His father was a black Algerian father, part of the colonial occupation. Here we see the contradictions again. He was sterilized when he was 16. He was also allowed to join the Hitler Youth. The father of a friend of his who was in the SS signed off on the necessary papers so he could work at a railroad. In 1939, he was conscripted to fight in the Wehrmacht along with his peers, only to be told that he was unworthy of service because he was black. Describing his precarious position within the system, Hauck explains to Tina Kamp why he tried to commit suicide when he was called for pre-military training. He said, the training was to be conducted by the Sturmabteilung, the brown shirts, and I never had anything to do with them. Here in the Hitler Youth, everyone knew me. No one would have wanted to do me any harm. Out there, no one knew me. I attempted suicide because I couldn't get away from it anymore. Proof of Aryan ancestry and that whole mess. Where would I get that from? He survived his suicide attempt, and in 1942 he was conscripted again. But this time he was accepted. So the same people, not even following the same rules. And he told Camp, maybe I could have refused, but then I wouldn't be able to talk about it now. I know about one such case, a friend that I was sterilized with. He never came back. He got sent to a camp, and I went because I saw it as a chance. It was the first time that I was treated the same as others, because the other Aryan German boys, my mates, they were called up too. And I wanted that. And then I was quite conscious of my fate, that I had a 50-50 chance. Either I survive it or I don't. And I survived. Hauck was sent to the Eastern Front, where he was made private first class within months, was wounded 5 times and captured by the Red Army in 1945, went on to spend 4 years in a Soviet camp. When it came to compensation after the war, black Germans who had lived through the Third Reich suddenly, visible as they were generally, became invisible to the bureaucracy. Fazia Jensen, the woman who I showed singing, was rejected several times because officials couldn't establish whether black people fell under the racial laws. And then there is Zoya Aqua Kaufman, who was born in Berlin to a Jewish mother and a Cameroonian father. She was forced out of school, refused the right to train as a pediatrician, became a dancer until she was banned from doing that too, and fled underground fearing sterilization. She was caught in Prague in 1944 with her son Hans Joachim, and they were sent to Pankratz prison in Czech Republic. Were only released on May the 13th, 1945. She eventually, after several applications, was offered compensation on the basis of her Jewish identity, but not her African identity. Every time I appeared in the office, the official's colleagues couldn't conceal their amusement. He kept saying, well, I may believe your father is a Negro, would be the politest translation. But the higher authorities don't have to believe it, since they can't see you. It does remind me of a time when I wrote in The Guardian about David Blunkett's racially problematic policies from the Home Office. And I was told, he can't be racist, he's blind. There are a number of broader lessons here, but for now I want to concentrate on just two. The first is the issue of visibility as it relates to racism. To bear the physical features of a group designated as inferior clearly matters. It shapes the nature of the racism you will experience, but it does not define it. What those features signify and the systemic response they will attract is entirely contingent on context. Here I want to give a couple of examples of context. The first is of Angela Davis, growing up in Birmingham, Alabama. And when she wanted to play a trick on the system, she would go in to try on shoes and dresses, and she would talk in French. And because she was talking in French, they assumed, I mean, I couldn't understand what she was saying, but they assumed, therefore, that she wasn't from Birmingham, Alabama, and therefore, what a joy to have a person from France in our store in this provincial town. And so so long as she was speaking French, she could do it. My father-in-law, who is very light-skinned African-American, and who grew up in Scotlandville, which is in Louisiana, where there was Jim Crow. And my wife asked him when she was younger, but you could have passed. Why didn't you just for the dignity, just go in and try on some clothes or go? And he said, well, I couldn't have gone with anyone. Who could I have gone with? And a bit like in Northern Ireland, I was one question away from being found out, but I couldn't go with any of my friends. It didn't seem any point. And then me personally, I studied French and Russian at university. So I spent 5 months in France, 5 months in Russia. The period in France was the most racially intense period of racism I've ever experienced, including being beaten up by the cops, but also stopped and frisked probably about 2 times a week. People asked me what colour you are when you're getting flats. Couldn't stop a cab for love nor money. Next I go to what was then Leningrad, and I experienced a very peculiar situation, which is that the African students in Leningrad are catching hell. This is 1991, America is in the ascendant. This is a brief moment where America is being lauded in the Soviet Union. The African students are catching hell, and Afro-Cubans are catching hell, because they are signifiers of the old regime and the follies of the old internationalism. Somehow, I had plaits, sneakers, whatever it was, I am understood not to be African, and therefore I could only be American. I mean, British doesn't occur to anybody. And so, in this moment, it's the only time in my life, before or since, I am equated with wealth and privilege. Cars stop and become cabs for me. Where are you going? I assume you will be paying in dollars. Please get in the cab. I have to vouch for my fellow white students if we're going into a hotel. It's okay, they're with me. As I say, it's never happened since. But throughout those times, I'm the same person. Both in France and Russia, I'm the same person. And I'm no less black than the African and Afro-Cuban people in Leningrad. But people, when you need to see the difference, people will find the difference that they need to make the distinction that they need to make. And this isn't just true of the objects of racism. It's true of racism itself when it comes to visibility. Put bluntly, you can't see racism any more than you can see democracy or capitalism. And this is where I think people get a bit tripped up when it comes to visibility. You can at times see the outcomes of racism: a rundown area in a segregated city, a vicious or a violent attack, a person screaming epithets. But racism is a system. It's a system of thought and control, and you can no more see it than you can, as I said, than you can see democracy or capitalism. And if that seems like an opaque point, then take for a minute the murder of George Floyd in 2020, because we all saw it. But it happened during the COVID pandemic at a time when black people were dying in far more disproportionate numbers than the US police could ever kill them. And they were particularly vulnerable because of where they lived, the jobs they did, the houses they lived in, the food they can afford, their ability to work from home, and so on. And these things aren't things that can be caught on camera and shared on Instagram or YouTube, but they are lethal, pervasive consequences of racism. And this matters because paradoxically, once you understand that racism isn't visible, then it makes it easy to see it for what it is. Not a series of isolated incidents, including malevolent bigots making vengeful decisions in a never-ending morality play, but a range of systemic processes built on presumption, assumption, confidence, ignorance, and exclusionary networks, all buttressed by the dead weight of privilege and historical domination. The moment of George Floyd's murder and the conflagration which ensued offered us an opportunity to trace that connective tissue between racism at its most banal and invisible and racism at its most brazen and clear. "I can't breathe" was not just the cry of the dying Floyd and the chant of the demonstrators, but the last gasps of the ailing pandemic patient on a respirator. Visible difference, which quite often is the difference the system trains us to see, precisely because they have consequence, can be crucial, but it doesn't have to be. And it makes sense to focus on it at times, but not to fetishize it. Because while it's a common feature of racist systems, it's neither a necessary nor a universal one. Which brings me to the second central lesson. That a system constructed with and through racial control will, by its nature, be prone to absurdities, contradictions, and inconsistencies. We start with the fact that race itself is a construct, a nonsense to make sense out of the system that racism has made. The definition of who or what is black or other shifts with time and place. In different moments in relative recent times, the Greeks, Irish, Portuguese, and Italians, for example, have not been considered white. Jews who are Caucasian can go in and out of being understood as white. As Barbara J. Field famously pointed out, in the West, a white woman can give birth to a black child, but a black woman cannot give birth to a white child. None of this makes sense outside of the context in which it is formed. But one of the problems that we have in understanding these systems of racial control is that we all too often take their premises at face value. In America during the 50s and 60s, the battle lines in the South were drawn between integration and segregation. But in reality, that was never the issue. The South was always far more integrated than the North. Black women breastfed white children, were forced to sleep with white men, servants often lived in the house or on the grounds. In most Southern autobiographies, the white child's best friend until school age is usually the gardener or the maid's child. Strom Thurmond, who ran for presidency in 1948 as a segregationist, had fathered a black daughter by a maid 20 years earlier. The issue was never whether people mixed, but on what basis and to what end. The issue wasn't integration, but white supremacy. So, when it comes to these systems of racial control, going back to Nazi Germany, but anywhere else, we shouldn't be looking for logic. As I said earlier, it doesn't have to make sense. It just has to work. Every now and then, though, there is a glitch in the matrix that shows the system up for what it really is. Sandra Lang, here, was born to two white apartheid-supporting Afrikaner parents in the small town of Retief near the Swazi border. Blood tests prove that she was her father's daughter. Yet Sandra emerged dark-skinned with afro hair. Arguably, a black girl. Bliss Broyard was raised in Bluebird, Connecticut, ostensibly with two white parents, only to be told by her father on his deathbed that he had in fact been passing his whole life. Are these two white women or two black women? Who cares, so long as they know their place? That is the answer. That in the end, Sandra Lang had to reclassify herself 3 times. Well, she was reclassified. Her parents reclassified her as white. And they were able to do that because the rule was if both your parents are white, then you are white. But then, so she was born white, she was changed to colour by her school and the authority. Her parents then changed her back to white. But she realised that she couldn't live as a white person. No one's going to marry her. No one's going to employ her. And so she then changes herself to colour. This boy, on the other hand, has the struggle of trying to work out, well, what do I do with this now? And she wrote a very good book called One Drop, which I recommend. To build a system rooted in and acting on these constructs compounds the initial contradiction. Because for them to work, there must be rules. The more a system relies on racial discrimination, the more is at stake. And frankly, the more bizarre the rules become. Among the various checks the apartheid system put in place was the pencil test, where they put a pencil in your hair and asked you to bend forward, and if it slid through, you were white, and if not, then you were coloured. On this, your whole life chances would depend. The fingernail test, pinker are the cuticles, the blacker the person, or the scrotum test, assigning race to boys on the basis of the shade of their testicular sac. In 1950, just to give you evidence of how difficult it is to wrestle these systems to the ground once they've been constructed, after the apartheid, 2 years after the apartheid regime was founded, the South African state came up with a definition of white for the Population Registration Act. And it reads thus: a white person is any person who in appearance obviously is or who is generally accepted as a white person, other than a person who, although in appearance obviously is a white person, is generally accepted as a coloured person. These are the descriptions that we have. And these rules matter, right? One of the things that came out of this was a guy called Mr. Song, who is Chinese, and he comes to the board and he says, everybody that I know thinks I'm white. I think I'm white. And actually he gets away with it. Quite a few other people don't. And finally, since both the identities and the systems are constructed by human beings, they are of course deeply flawed, because however much effort they put into parsing and ranking humanity into its convenient component parts, the array of human difference confounds whatever system they erect. The system of extermination that the Third Reich built in order to create a dystopia of racial purity was incredibly efficient in its murderous intent, but it was neither rational nor consistent in its targets. Rhineland bastards notwithstanding, unlike Jews, black people had not been woven tight into Germany's story of decline and discord, and so unpicking them from the fabric of German society was not understood as a priority, which also meant that they were not understood to qualify for any reparatory justice afterwards. The fact that they were visibly different impacted the dynamics of their discrimination and the challenges they faced in avoiding it, but it didn't determine the intensity of their oppression. It's not that the system could not detect their difference, but that its impulses were not geared towards acting on that particular finding. It was neither refined nor comprehensive enough to decipher what it saw in a timely manner. It was not indifferent to the fact of colour difference, it was just ambivalent as to how to respond to it. So while their impression was systemic, as I've said, it was not in nature, it was not systematic in application. And this ambivalence allowed the space for considerable discretion. For while the system was pathological in its capacity to dehumanise and murder, the fact that it was nonetheless run by humans allowed for a level of morality to seep through. We know from other accounts of Germans hiding, saving or rescuing Jews that space for decency and humanity existed in other contexts. But with Germans of African descent, there was more space, more autonomy within that space, and more people prepared to use that space than for other groups. And that was because, in no small part, the consequences for operating in that space were less severe and less predictable. Going back to the metaphor about racism being a language of many dialects, the Nazis spoke anti-Semitism fluently, whereas with anti-black racism they were still kind of doing an intermediate course. They were simultaneously, black Germans were simultaneously hyper-visible and invisible. One could see them clearly in the flesh, but when it came to, for example, the German history of colonialism or qualifications for reparatory justice, they were nowhere to be found. They couldn't deny they were black. They could not prove that they were German. If racism is a language of many dialects, then the Nazis were only getting started with anti-black racism. But they had a long bloody, proven record that they were masters of the vernacular and that they could make themselves eventually understood. Thank you.